Hi, I'm Jim Carroll. I'm the CEO of the Diatribe Foundation. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our 16th virtual Musings. Thank you for joining us today as we explore the fascinating topic of clinical trials in diabetes, working to improve lives. I love that title. I think today's discussion promises to share some interesting insights into the world of clinical trials, and our speakers will help us better understand the different stages from clinical development to the challenges faced in recruiting underrepresented minorities. And then more specifically, we want to explore the groundbreaking strides being made in diabetic retinal disease, as well as beta cell replacement therapy. But before we get started, I want to give a huge thank you to all the sponsors of our 2023 Musing series who make this opportunity and all of our opportunities for us to learn free, starting with our very generous platinum sponsor, AstraZeneca. The folks at AstraZeneca develop therapies that not only improve A1C and time in range, but also significantly reduce the risk and the consequences of diabetes complications. I also want to thank our gold sponsors, Abbott, Dexcom, Lilly, Novo Nordisk, Sanofi, and Vertex. And our silver sponsors, Genentech and Ionis. All these companies are responsible for the development of groundbreaking technologies and therapies that allow people with diabetes to live healthier lives, and they provide essential support for those of us who work here at Diatribe to pursue our mission to improve the lives of people with diabetes through education and advocacy. I'm so very happy to introduce our moderator for today's panel discussion, Dr. Alan Moses. Alan is trained in internal medicine and endocrinology. Alan has been a professor at Harvard Medical School, as well as the chief medical officer at the Joslin Diabetes Center. And he was also the global chief medical officer at Novo Nordisk. I think he retired in 2018, but now he's an independent consultant in the pharmaceutical and the biotechnology sector. And most importantly to me, he is the chair of our board, and we are extremely fortunate to have his knowledge, his expertise, and his dedication. Before Alan begins, it's my special pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. To make some opening remarks, Dr. Julie Shea, a health scientist from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. Dr. Shea's career has been a dedicated pursuit in advancing the health of diverse populations. Her profound commitment to identifying strategies for the improvement of public health among vulnerable communities stands as a testament to her unwavering dedication. With a background rooted in infectious disease epidemiology, I love that word, she's conducted groundbreaking research across several continents, examining the intersections between behaviors and health and the influences on marginalized populations. Her expertise is helping bridge the gap between research and meaningful action, and fostering collaborations that resonate with the mission of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. So please welcome Dr. Julie Shea.
Hello and good evening, and thank you, Jim, for that kind introduction. I'm honored to be joining you today for the December Musings. I'm also pleased to be here today representing the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I decided to look up the word musings earlier today. According to Merriam-Webster, the first usage of the word musing dates back to the 14th century, long before anyone could have envisioned we'd be able to deliver our own musings to hundreds, thousands, or even millions of people. While we look forward to the musings to come from our speakers today, I'm happy to have the opportunity to provide some information about our office. The Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at FDA sits within the Office of the Commissioner and engages broadly across the agency, as well as with public and private sector stakeholders and organizations, such as Diatribe. I want to express appreciation for your ongoing efforts around clinical trials, including your meeting in May with the Time in Range Coalition and publication of your recent special edition on clinical trials. The Office of Minority Health and Health Equity also have a dedicated mission to protect and promote the health of diverse populations through research and communication that address health disparities and advance health equity. Central to the conversation today, and a long-lasting priority for the FDA, is our commitment to increasing enrollment of diverse populations in clinical trials through hosting public meetings and developing resources and tools. We have also launched several initiatives and issued multiple guidance documents. And at our office, we are proud to support the FDA centers and offices as we work together towards achieving this goal. Within OMHHE specifically, we have long worked and remain committed to advancing diversity in clinical trials through multiple cross-cutting activities from research and collaboration and outreach and communication. For example, we have an ongoing multimedia public education and outreach campaign to help address some of the barriers preventing diverse communities from participating in clinical trials. The campaign aims to educate consumers about key issues, combat myths, and provide positive messaging about participation in clinical trials. Our campaign and materials also include spokespersons who represent the communities we're trying to reach and are provided in multiple languages. We also have broad stakeholder engagements, including listening sessions, collaborations and partnerships, and ongoing research efforts. We are constantly adding new tools and resources. We have campaigns that are tailored for specific diseases and conditions. One example is our recent partnership with the Office of Minority Health at the Department of Health and Human Services. That campaign is called the Let's Take Charge campaign that aims to advance diversity and inclusion across lupus clinical research. I also want to highlight one of our more recent initiatives, our Enhanced Equity Initiative. Through this initiative, we were able to provide multiple funding opportunities that have allowed us to engage with diverse researchers and scientists across various organizations and academic institutions. The initiative has three key aims: enhancing equity in clinical trials by continuing our efforts to advance diversity in clinical trials, equitable data efforts by funding research that help us increase data available on the populations we serve. And finally, our equity of voices, which focuses on continuing to understand diverse patient perspectives, preferences, and unmet needs to inform our work. Under this initiative, we have funded over 20 projects aimed at understanding barriers and challenges, as well as innovative strategies to advance diversity in clinical trials. We are especially proud that some of the institutions to receive awards are HBCUs, MSIs, and other organizations representing diverse communities. One of our current research projects funded under the Enhanced Equity Initiative is titled Increasing Understanding of Diabetes Home Use Devices in Tribal and Urban Indigenous Communities. I encourage everyone to find out more about the Enhanced Equity Initiative by visiting the OMHHE website. And specifically, I hope you will consider sharing and applying for our funding opportunities with others in your community. We know that variations associated with race and ethnicity have been correlated with risks for certain diseases, conditions, and responses to regulated products. Enrollment in clinical trials should reflect the diversity of the population that is ultimately going to use the product. Understanding these factors remains important for identifying and addressing disparities in health and is vital to achieving health equity. As we continue to seek forward-seeking solutions, including more diverse representation in clinical trials and advancing health equity-focused research, it has never been more important to engage the communities we seek to serve in developing those solutions. I want to close with an expression of appreciation and gratitude from the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity for all of the work that you are doing, because we know that each of us has an important role in achieving health equity. So with the work of the Time in Range Coalition and the Diatribe Foundation, we are encouraged about the potential to make advancements in diabetes clinical trial research and in clinical trial research more generally. Thank you again, and I know today's participants are in for an engaging panel discussion.
topics that Dr. Shea discussed in her opening remarks, and I think the agency is to be commended for their efforts in trying to assure that the entire population, all representative groups, can benefit from the outcomes of clinical trials and the drugs that ultimately are approved. One thing is certain in modern medicine. All new laboratory discoveries must go through the gauntlet of clinical trials before they become approved by regulatory authorities and appear in the hands of people who will benefit from them. Clinical trials come in all shapes and sizes, from the first exposure in humans known as phase 1, all the way to so-called real-world evidence trials that simulate the use of drugs as they would be prescribed and taken by persons with the disease in question. Diabetes provides a prime example of how clinical trials can improve the lives of people living with diabetes. From the standpoint of drug development, each phase of clinical development has its own unique challenges. Today, we will explore some of these challenges with 4 experts who encompass a broad range of personal experience that have helped important new molecules become approved medications that target specific abnormalities in diabetes. More specifically, we'll use 2 quite different clinical conditions, as Jim Carroll mentioned earlier, to explore how clinical trials are designed, how one can assure a balanced representation of the affected population in the trials, and some of the unique challenges that exist for one specific indication, beta cell replacement or islet replacement in type 1 diabetes. We hope that the lessons that our distinguished speakers will share with you will give you a better appreciation for how difficult it is to develop new medications for diabetes. Importantly, we hope that our discussion will encourage some of you to participate in clinical trials if you have never done so before. Today, we're fortunate to have 4 experts join us for what I hope will be an animated discussion. You've already heard from Dr. Shea, who has set the stage for a very important aspect of designing and conducting clinical trials, and that is assuring that the results are relevant for all populations. I'm going to introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. Dr. Anastasia Albanese O'Neill is an advanced practice nurse, diabetes educator, and PhD, who currently serves as an associate vice president at JDRF International, responsible for type 1 diabetes education and clinical implementation. She has extensive experience in pediatric diabetes education from her time at the University of Florida and has published on diabetes education, quality improvement, and diabetes technology. Importantly, as recognition of her stature, she was chosen as the 2023 Diabetes Care and Education Specialist by the Association of Diabetes Care and Education Specialists. Our next speaker is Dr. Manuel Amador, who serves as a medical director within medical affairs and ophthalmology for Genentech. He's an ophthalmologist with additional training as a retina specialist, having completed his fellowship at University of California, San Diego in 2019. Besides a professional interest in diabetic retinopathy and macular disease, Dr. Amador also is passionate about assuring that diversity and equity are achieved in the design and execution of clinical trials. You'll be hearing about one such trial in a few moments. Dr. Ann Peters is a world-renowned diabetologist who both practices diabetes medicine and holds a professorship in clinical medicine at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. I've had the pleasure of knowing Ann for many years and watching her contribute in a major way to multiple important clinical trials in diabetes, with a major focus on both new drugs and new technology. Her clinical practice spans Beverly Hills and an underserved community in East Los Angeles, where she has firsthand knowledge of some of the challenges of achieving equity in diabetes clinical trials. Ann has been recognized with multiple awards, including the Outstanding Physician Clinician Award from the American Diabetes Association. And last in our alphabetical array of accomplished clinician researchers in diabetes is Dr. Jennifer Sun, who is an associate professor of ophthalmology at Harvard Medical School and with a primary appointment at the Joslin Diabetes Center, where she is senior investigator in research and chief of the Center for Clinical Eye Research and Trials. Dr. Sun's research interests are in the vascular abnormalities that characterize eye complications in diabetes. She has been one of the leaders in developing a national network for conducting clinical trials in diabetes eye disease. She's also a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Medical School, and also holds an MPH degree from the Harvard School of Public Health. So, without further delay, let's get into the heart of our subject matter for today. As you've heard from Dr. Shea, the FDA not only is committed to helping companies design trials that will demonstrate drug safety and efficacy, but also is committed to assuring that participants in trials represent the entire populations of individuals who will be treated with these drugs. It's not always an easy task, but really defines equity in clinical trials and working to achieve appropriate representation of underrepresented minority populations who often are disproportionately affected by the disease in question. And unfortunately, diabetes is an excellent example of that. Before we dive specifically into these issues, let's take a general look at how clinical trials are conducted and some of the impediments to recruitment of individuals who indeed represent the target population for treatment. Anastasia, in your role at JDRF, you see many proposals for clinical trials covering the full spectrum of type 1 diabetes. Let's provide our audience with a background that they'll need to better understand drug development and the clinical trial process. Can you provide an overview of the stages of clinical development in terms of the sequence of the trials, the size of the trials, the goals of the trials, and the types of individuals who are recruited?
Absolutely. And thanks for that question, Dr. Moses, because at the core of a person's decision to participate or make a decision for their child to participate in a clinical trial is informed consent. And that at its base means being informed, having a clear understanding of how drugs, devices, or therapies make its way through the discovery process is a piece of knowledge that we think is really critical. We generally think about the research pathway with that preclinical phase, which is before the drug or therapy touches a human, and then 4 additional phases. And each one builds on the results of the previous phase. And that drug or therapy or device can fail really at any point. This can take decades to get through the entire process. I could spend a lot of time talking about the preclinical phase, but in the interest of time, I'll just note that the development of therapies, including novel therapies, can take years and again, usually decades. So what are the phases that people should be thinking about when they're evaluating clinical research participation? The first is phase 1. This is a small number of people, often 20 or less, and the key word here is safety. So during a phase 1 of a clinical trial, investigators are looking at the effects of the drug or therapy, usually on people who don't have underlying health conditions. This phase aims to figure out the dose that a person can take without serious side effects, if any at all. And investigators monitor participants very, very closely. So there are a number of clinic visits to see how their bodies react to the therapy. And they're also looking at what's the best way to deliver it. Could a person wear a patch? Can they take it as a pill? Do they need to be given the drug via IV? Is it a hepatic portal infusion? How can that drug be administered? And again, if it's found to be safe, it makes its way through phase 1 and goes on to phase 2. Phase 2 trials are bigger, usually about 100 people. And these are looking about how the treatment affects the body and if it has benefit. So does it work? Phase 2 of a clinical trial involves sometimes a couple hundred people, usually around 100. And these participants now are living with the condition that this drug or therapy is targeted to. They're usually given the same dose that was found to be safe in the previous phase, phase 1. And investigators monitor these participants again to see how effective the therapy is and to gather more information about side effects. If the drug succeeds at phase 2, it moves on to phase 3. Now, these are large studies. At least more than 100 usually, sometimes up to thousands of participants. And in this phase, we want to know if this new therapy or drug is better than what's already out there. So this phase includes people living with the condition, and it can last for several years. Some trials in the type 1 diabetes space have lasted almost a decade. And the purpose here of these phase 3 studies is to evaluate how the new therapy works in comparison, again, to existing therapies. So investigators want to know if it's at least as safe and as effective as, again, what is already available. Phase 3 trials include randomization. So you may be in a group that gets the drug or a group that gets placebo. And they're usually what we call double blind, which means neither the participant nor the investigator knows which medication the participant is getting. And this eliminates bias when interpreting those results. If the drug or therapy does well at this phase and is shown to be safe and effective, compared with what's already out there, the FDA will usually approve, but we've got representatives who can say more about that than I can. Finally, we have phase 4 trials. These are after the drug or therapy is approved, and these are part of post-market safety monitoring, and data are collected to better understand sort of long-term safety and efficacy. Sorry, it's a long answer, but it's a bit complicated, but we think this core knowledge is really important for your listeners.
Absolutely agree, and I think you did it extremely clearly. Thank you, Anastasia. Let's take it a step further. How do you identify individuals who you believe are good candidates for participation in a clinical trial, whether it be in type 1 diabetes, just treatment, whether it be for, diabetes eye disease or transplantation or anything else?
Yeah, so we've got some great clinical trialists on the call, so I'm going to leave it to them to talk about their specific strategies for identifying and recruiting individuals specifically to their studies. What I can say from a JDRF standpoint, when we think about type 1 diabetes, it affects 1.5 million people in the US, over 8 million around the world. It affects people of all races and ethnicities. And individuals can be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 1 year, at 21 years of age, at 51 years of age, really across the lifespan, which is a message we're trying to get across. Our goal at JDRF is to think very carefully about how we can make sure the diabetes community, and that means all members of the community, are aware of the importance of clinical research to our shared mission to prevent, cure, and find better treatments for people living with diabetes. We think all people with type 1 diabetes or with diabetes more generally and their family members should learn about research participation. So an important part is for people to understand how the research process works. We just talked a little bit about that it's voluntary. What are some of the benefits and risks and how they can get involved? We think that people should participate where they feel comfortable. We do want them to raise their hands and step forward, but maybe that's participating in a 2-question survey to make the clinical experience better. Maybe it's participating in a study on a novel therapeutic. We've invested $2.5 billion in research over the years. So in addition to that funding of studies, we see ourselves in a role of providing education about clinical trials, inspiring people to learn more about them, and then doing the really important step of connecting them to the clinical trial coordinators and investigators like those on the panel with me today to learn more about a specific study.
Anastasia, I think you raised a really good point by bringing up the age range of individuals, particularly in type 1 diabetes trials, from infants to octogenarians, because type 1 diabetes actually does affect all of those populations. We're going to hear a little more about some of the ophthalmic complications, which tend to occur in somewhat older individuals, not the 1-year-olds. And there's some real challenges in meeting that spectrum of age and having individuals understand what they can contribute to the process of developing new therapies, new treatments. But let's take it from the other side. And unfortunately, we've lost Dr. Peters to some technical issues. So I'm going to ask some of you to help me fill in here in terms of some of the questions we have. And I'm going to direct this both to you and to Dr. Sun. And that is, what are the benefits for individuals to participate in clinical trials? I mean, why should they even consider it?
Well, I love hearing the... Oh, go. I was going to say, I love hearing Anastasia's passion and enthusiasm for the research effort, including clinical research. Of course, it's very near and dear to my heart. And the question of how and why do participants benefit from participating in clinical trials is a really important one. Now, I will say sometimes, I think there's a range of possibilities depending on the study, depending on the trial, depending on the interventions that are being done. We at Jolson Diabetes Center make a huge effort to fully integrate our clinical care with our clinical research, because I strongly believe that it's only through fully screening all of your patients for possible participation in clinical studies, informing them of those opportunities, where and when they exist, and giving them the option to participate, even if they decide that they're not interested or it's not a good time. And many people say this is not the right time, but thank you for talking to me about it. It's a way of providing education. It's a way of providing access to cutting edge care. It's a way of providing access to the thought processes that are really at the forefront of the field. I think the direct benefits of participating in a study frequently are the fact that we follow our clinical study participants very closely. We get to know them very well. At Joslin, we try and be very flexible with their visit times, and that's often helpful. We because we're seeing them so regularly, and there's a big safety net in terms of patient reminders and calls, and so forth. We catch their eye disease if they need treatment, and we're able to talk to them and counsel them, in ways where, although we try and provide the same care across the board, our study visits give us a little more flexibility and a little more time with our patients. I will say one of the joys of being a clinical trialist is developing the long-term relationships we have with our study patients. And, my long-term study coordinators, one of whom has been at Joslin for literally decades, get to know those patients really, really well. I think the last benefit I will mention is really an altruistic one. Many of our study participants, we enroll them into these studies, and there's a very important concept of equipoise. We don't know which intervention, which treatment arm will be better, or we couldn't ethically enroll patients. We think that either one might have some benefit to our participants. But so they may not know which arm they're being enrolled in. We may not be able to control that. I think a lot of our participants get a benefit just from what they're contributing to the field, what they're contributing to the knowledge to care for other patients with diabetes, and sometimes family members and other folks down the road into the future.
Thanks for those insights, Jennifer. Anything to add, Anastasia? I'm going to turn to Manuel to see if he wants to add something as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to add, and it's hard for me to be on a diabetes panel without it sort of bleeding over into my personal reason for working in this field, and that's our daughter who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 22 years ago at the age of 16 months. We enrolled her in a study at diagnosis. It was the SEARCH study, as it turned out, and what we learned from that was that type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes was on the increase in youth. All of our family members have participated in research, and I'm currently participating in a study there. I call it the pancreas selfie study. That's very colloquial, but they're measuring the size of my pancreas as compared with people living with type 1 and those who have autoantibodies. I think for some parents out there, it's an opportunity. I don't live with type 1 diabetes, but it's an opportunity to do something. Sometimes I think we feel pretty helpless. But at JDRF more generally, I would say we think clinical trials are essential. We funded early clinical trials and continuous glucose monitors and automated insulin delivery. Those things are not just theoretical. They're on people's bodies and changing outcomes in type 1 diabetes and frankly, improving quality of life. We want all people with diabetes to have the opportunity, I think, as Dr. Sun said, to consider participation in clinical trials. And the reason we're focused on education and awareness is because we want people to make those informed, thoughtful, independent decisions about research participation for themselves and their children.
Great. Dr. Amador, do you have, we're going to talk specifically about your trial in a little bit, but any more general comments about how to encourage specifically underrepresented minorities to engage in the clinical trial process, to educate them about the opportunities and the potential advantages?
Definitely. And I want to echo what Jennifer kind of just mentioned, which is basically the opportunities to bring access to this population it's a very big deal. And these, especially minorities, they do appreciate this. And just a small example of what we're doing with Elevatum, for example, is that we're covering for the fellow eye. So that's huge. That's a very, very important part of, like, if you're considering treatment for one eye, usually diabetes affects both eyes. So it's always very important to take these types of things into consideration, because this really brings that additional support for the patient. And the other thing that Jennifer also mentioned, which I also agree it's very important, is the close monitoring. Because we do notice that when these patients are followed very closely, the outcomes actually are much, much better. And we do see this very impactful in our trial. So definitely completely agree with Jennifer and Anastasia.
So, I had a question for Dr. Peters about whether she believed, and I think all of you have answered this in slightly different ways, whether individuals who participate in clinical trials actually receive better or more diligent care. And I don't think that it's necessarily intentional that we try to give them better care, but the support systems around them, the reminders, the appointment reminders, as Dr. Sun said, the education about their disease state are things that, unfortunately, in routine practice, clinicians, whether they be physicians or nurse educators, just don't have the time or opportunity to deliver in a way that can really help an individual understand the challenges or the problems that they have with their disease state.
Yeah, Dr. Moses, I just want, oops, sorry. I just wanted to add, some clinic visits are 20 minutes, but if part of your study protocol is an oral glucose tolerance test and you've got a couple hours with a diabetes educator, you can really dig deep into a lot of really important diabetes education that might not happen otherwise. And some of that is incidental. It might not be part of the protocol, but it's additional knowledge that is very, very powerful, and that follows that person after leaving the study. Sorry to jump in there, but I think it's just a real
no. I think it's a great point. In other words, what you're saying is you have a captive audience, and you can't help and shouldn't help but speak to them about not only about their life and what's happening with the trial and are things going smoothly, but more about their diabetes. I think that's actually really important. I think one other thing for all of us to remember, by all of us, I mean the listening audience here, is that more and more, each of us in our routine care are becoming part of data repositories. The cloud, if you will, contains a lot of information that ultimately is interrogated, is questioned by investigators to determine relationships that we may not have thought about, that become possible only because we have huge numbers of individuals who we can look at to discern some of these interesting elements of diabetes and its complications that we ultimately can study more directly with a designed, controlled clinical trial. And I think that's one of the great advantages of how data now are changing the way, large data sets are changing the way we think about disease. Now, maybe it's time to get a little more specific and explore the first of the two conditions we're going to discuss. Both Dr. Sun and Amador have already alluded to this, but let's talk about eye disease in diabetes. Eye complications in diabetes have begun to decline for individuals who utilize current technologies. That is, the ability to achieve better glycemic control than was ever possible before with lower risks, and who then achieve good levels of glucose control. Unfortunately, there are still too many individuals who are susceptible to and are developing either or both diabetic proliferative retinopathy or macular edema. Hi, Ann Peters. Welcome.
Hi. I've been listening because they couldn't get me into this room. So I've heard everything you've said and have been waving at you, but you couldn't see me. I'm being driven in a car because I wanted to be part of this, and I figured if I was driving, I would crash. So I'm in the back of a car.
Okay, well, we'll engage you. I've distributed some of the questions I had for you to our other speakers, but we'll get back to you.
I heard.
So, all right. So, proliferative retinopathy, macular edema. These are big words, and not everybody understands what they mean. But each can result in dramatic deterioration in vision. And this is not. Let me stress: this is not a disease state or disease states that occur only in type 1 diabetes. In fact, from a prevalence perspective, it's more common in type 2 diabetes because there is so much more type 2 diabetes. Now, fortunately, new therapies are being developed to arrest the consequences of these two conditions and preserve visual acuity, and we're going to get into that. So, Dr. Sun, could you give us an overview of some of the current challenges posed by diabetic retinopathy and maculopathy? I mean, can you just, what are they? What are these clinical conditions for our lay audience?
Sure. So for folks who don't live and breathe diabetic retinopathy, what we see is that in patients, actually, as soon as diabetes is diagnosed, if we look carefully enough, we can see changes in blood flow, changes in how the white blood cells, react to the vessel walls, even before we can look in and see clinically visible abnormalities in the retina, in the eye. But over time, many patients, the vast majority of patients, 90+%, in the old epidemiologic studies, given long enough duration of their diabetes, 15, 20 years or so, tend to develop some changes that are clinically visible. And we tend to focus clinically on the issues to do with blood vessels, because those are the things we see in the eye. There has become a growing awareness that diabetes is not just a vascular disease in the eye. There are very important changes to the neural retina, which ultimately are the things that really drive vision loss. But for purposes of the last 50 or more years, actually, what we've done is we've classified diabetic retinopathy based on the vascular changes that we can see. Sometimes we can see small little areas of bleeding or changes in the blood vessels. In the most advanced forms of diabetic retinopathy, we start to see the growth of new vessels in the retina. And my patients always think it sounds good when I say, oh, there are some new vessels here, but these vessels are abnormal, they're incompetent, they bleed, they leak. They can stretch across the retina and create scarring and retinal detachment. So when we see them, we actually want to treat them to try and get rid of them or cause them to regress. Diabetic macular edema, that you also mentioned, is another major vision-threatening complication of diabetic retinopathy. And that is represented by swelling of the central retina. What happens is the vessels, the normal retinal vessels, become leaky because there are issues with the junctions between the cells. And so fluid comes out of the blood vessels, goes into the retinal tissue, and the retina swells like a sponge. When it does that, we see that the cell connections get stretched. The neural retina doesn't work as well in many people as it used to, and people can experience some blurry vision. So the good thing is that, as Dr. Moses mentioned, we have very effective treatments for both proliferative diabetic retinopathy, where new blood vessels grow, and diabetic macular edema that have been developed over the last decades. And we're also very fortunate because we've had large-scale seminal clinical trials in our field that have clearly shown the efficacy of first laser treatment as treatment for both proliferative disease and diabetic macular edema, and now in our new era of medical management, injections with medications called anti-VEGF medications that target a protein vascular endothelial growth factor. That's a factor that increases leakiness of vessels and promotes growth of new vessels. So when you block it, often those improve. The challenges that we have are severalfold. One is that although these treatments are very effective, we have major issues on a worldwide basis in terms of global access to the kind of specialized care, the kind of specialized treatments and technologies that it takes to get these treatments. And so we're really looking for new therapies that are readily available, affordable, scalable to a global population. Some of the other challenges that we have are that these therapies are effective enough that they've made hitting the thresholds that the FDA and other regulatory agencies use to determine how effective therapies are and whether or not they should gain clinical approval, more difficult to treat. So when you're comparing against our current standard therapies, it's harder and harder to meet targets like improvements of 3 lines of vision loss. We're moving into earlier stage disease. We're looking in our field now at how do we not just treat late stage disease where people have lost vision already, but very importantly, and particularly I think for young people who are developing diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, who have decades of life ahead of them, we want to preserve vision. We want to prevent the onset of retinopathy, and we want to prevent the loss of any vision. And so some of the challenges that we've been taking up in things like the DRCR Retina Network, which is a large NIH-sponsored consortium of clinical sites across North America, looking at retinal disease, and the Mary Tyler Moore Vision Initiative, which is an accelerator for efforts in diabetic retinal disease, is the need to develop new endpoints, the need to develop new ways to measure visual function so that we can get more sensitive, more specific ways to describe how diabetes affects people and their vision, so that we can then have the next wave of care and new therapies developing.
Thank you very much. That was very clear, very comprehensive. I'm going to take a moment to divert to Dr. Peters and ask, because Dr. Peters, who is an internist, not an ophthalmologist, but has practices in two settings, one in Hollywood, one in East LA. Over the years, Anne, have you seen a difference in terms of the prevalence of eye disease in those two populations? And if so, why? And what might we be able to do about it?
Well, I've seen a huge change in my West Side population, which are patients who have access to healthcare. And people, obviously, who've had longer duration disease didn't have the same ability to achieve the same glycemic control. And they often develop retinopathy that gets treated, but they don't go blind. And back in the old days, when I first started practicing, people routinely in my practice were blind, even on the West Side, because we didn't have the therapies we have. So I don't have any patients, zero, whether they have retinopathy or not, who are going blind on the West Side. And most of my patients now don't even develop retinopathy. If they do, it's really background retinopathy. It's not vision threatening. In East LA, where patients don't have access to healthcare, it is as bad as ever. My patients, I look to see if they don't have retinopathy. I just simply look at how much retinopathy they have. And I have, people in their late 20s, early 30s who are blind, and there's nothing we can do. I mean, I get patients with such advanced eye disease at such young ages, it breaks your heart. And that doesn't happen on the other side of town. And it's all about access to healthcare and, the right tools for treating it. But it's awful what I see in East LA.
Yeah, thanks for those insights. I think it is awful. I think it speaks to the basic inequity of healthcare in the United States as it's being insured or not insured at the moment. And it's something that, unfortunately, medicine can't often solve, and society has to figure out how to solve. What about in your population in East LA, and is there a willingness to participate in clinical trials or a reluctance? And if so, why is there a reluctance?
So I started doing research there over 20 years ago. And they, as well as people in South LA, which is primarily Black, at least where we were, said, why should we work with you? You researchers come in, you use us for your research, you get your data, and then you leave, and we're no better off than when you started. And so I promised them, that I wouldn't leave, and that everything I've done has been community-based. And so I asked the people in those communities what I can do to help them. And so as such, we've developed trust. And we have all of these patients who trust us. And I can't give them continuous care because I don't have that ability. But they will join us for doing clinical trials, and they're really good at it because they trust us. But then my coordinators are all from the communities. So my coordinators know these people, they know their problems. They are really good at dealing with people who are about to become unhomed. They know how to deal with food insecurity. They know we have our own little fleet of Uber drivers who we send out into the communities to fetch the patients. We have clinics, and they meet with us in the evenings. We do the weekends where they can't miss work. We connect them to social services. We do that stuff that makes them feel connected. And then I could talk for hours about starting with the informed consent process, because even the most simple informed consents, they don't understand research as an entity. And so we spend a lot of time writing scripts and going through this very carefully and bringing family members in. And it's been a process, but we can do research with the best of anybody because of my staff. It's not because of me, it's because of the people I work with. But we were a look-ahead site. We can do big national trials and keep up with recruitment, and we have great retention. So I can do it. But the thing for me is that when somebody ends a trial, so say they go into a device trial, then I have to stop having them access to the device at the end of the trial. And you suddenly got someone's A1C down from 12 to 7, and now that tool has to go away. And I can't do that. I morally cannot do that. So I get donors from my Westside practice to donate to pay for the devices so my patients can stay on them, because I can't make somebody better in a trial and take that improvement away. I think it's just immoral.
That's an interesting point that I'm afraid we won't have time to dive into completely, but kudos to you for sure for the approach that you take, Dr. Peters, in assuring that your patients who participate in clinical trials can derive the benefit from continued appropriate therapy. Let's go now to a specific example, and we're going to turn to you, Dr. Amador. Genentech sponsored a trial. Dr. Amador designed it and oversaw it, that directly addressed some of the inequities that occur routinely in recruiting subjects for retinal disease trials. And the specific issue was to assure that underrepresented minorities are indeed recruited, and to assure that the results from clinical trials can be applied to those individuals as well, based on the results. So can you describe for us the approach that you took in helping to design and conduct the Elevatum trial, specifically focused on diabetic retinal disease in underserved minorities?
Definitely. So first of all, we have to understand that, or at least it was also very important for us to try to understand which were the main barriers that actually prevented these populations to enter the clinical trials. And there are two big groups here. We have operational barriers from the clinical trials per se, and there's also medical barriers that also have, when you design a trial, you have to keep into consideration, especially in the inclusion criteria, that you are kind of also changing certain criteria to allow certain populations to also be on the trial. So on the operational part, the first thing that we wanted to do is first select sites that actually have those populations. So we did a very kind of comprehensive feasibility exercise all across the US. We have the resources, we have the teams that are actually able to look into multiple of sites that have already worked with us and try to understand which ones have recruited better specific or more diverse populations, as well as reaching out to sites or newer sites that are actually focusing on more community types of centers. So that was one of the things that actually had more impact on the trial, because something that nice that I can kind of share now with you guys is that the trial actually ended up enrolling really well. So it was actually a very successful and nice story to tell. Another effort, at least on the operational part, that we really wanted to take into consideration is, and that actually motivates a lot the patients on, which is getting physicians that are also part of these populations involved, not only in the trial per se, but in the design. And that also proved to be very, very helpful, because as Dr. Peters was mentioning, like, you have populations from certain areas that are very different from populations from different areas. And there's always barriers and challenges when you try to convince certain populations to join a trial. And those barriers are, or those conversations are much easily taken if the person that you are talking to actually shares your same language or your same color of skin. So that actually has a huge impact. And we noticed that in Elevatum. We had amazing physicians that were part of this group, of these populations. And we also did an exercise and went a little beyond, going also translating all our resources towards multiple languages, not only Spanish, but also Portuguese, because we also wanted to have Hispanics and Latinos, Latin Americans. 1/3 of Latin Americans are from Brazil. So we wanted also to kind of go a little beyond that. So we did that, at least on the operational part. Now, on the medical part, it's another kind of challenge because there are different barriers. And something that Dr. Sun and also Dr. Peters mentioned was these patients tend to arrive with worse disease. And what does this mean? So it could be on the systemic part, like what Dr. Peters was sharing, which is they do come with worse HbA1c. or they could also come with worse diabetic retinopathy, which both of them can be barriers if you think about these patients enrolling in the trial. So usually current trials limit the HbA1c to 10%. And this can have a huge impact, especially in populations from underrepresented populations, because when they actually reach this more advanced care, like the retina specialists, they actually might already have HbA1cs that are extremely high and might be the limiting factor for them to actually enter the clinical trial. So at Genentech, we actually did an exercise and an effort to look specifically into this criteria of HbA1c, and we noticed that out of every 100 patients, specifically African Americans, we were excluding more African Americans and more Hispanics than Caucasian white when we actually kept the HbA1c to 10%. So for this trial, what we did was, again, we changed that parameter to allow populations for 12%. And I can actually share now that that actually had a huge impact, because 20% of our patients that reached our trial had HbA1cs that were above 10%. So that actually had an important impact on enrollment. So it's those types of considerations that we also need to take into kind of our, when we design our trials, that will help later on to really allow these groups to enter the trials. It's something that we found very interesting and was actually very successful.
Dr. Amador, in that trial with the higher entry A1C up to 12%, did you find that participation in the trial improved their glucose control? I'm not talking about their eye disease now, but their glucose control just because they were participating?
Yes, 100%. And this is something that also Jennifer was kind of alluding to, which is when you monitor closely these patients, they tend to start following more into kind of certain regimens or certain parameters. There's discussion with the physician more often. There's discussion regarding the diet, that they are moving more. There's definitely, and we immediately noticed that because we have been measuring the HbA1c, something also very important that we did in this trial is to measure certain parameters, not only the eye, but also that encompass the whole body, including the diabetic part, the systemic part. So we're measuring HbA1cs in different time points during the trial. And we did notice that the HbA1c has a decline as we go through the trial. So definitely we are seeing this, and we actually have evidence of it.
So another example of how participation in a clinical trial can actually improve your overall care, your overall outcome, if you will, independent of the specific issue that's being addressed by the trial. Dr. Sun, you're involved in the Retinal Disease Trial Network. Are there lessons to learn from what Dr. Amador has done at Genentech vis-a-vis this particular trial?
Very much. I've been trying to take careful note, because I think, I really applaud Dr. Amador and Genentech for doing the Elevatum trial. I think that kind of effort is really critical as we hopefully become growingly aware of the importance of diversity, and equity and inclusion efforts in our clinical studies. And so these kinds of lessons in terms of, thinking about how we liberalize the A1C criteria, thinking about how we approach patients. I think the thing that he and Dr. Peters mentioned about having both investigators and study coordinators who your target populations, the people you want to recruit, can relate to and are part of those cultures and whatever else, is really important. I'll say from the DRCR Retina Network side, we're keenly aware, I think, of the need to continually push, to try and open our studies to underrepresented minorities and folks who might not always, have the easiest path into clinical studies. And so one of the things that we are focusing on are innovative ways to both recruit and then retain patients. I've been delighted. We've had a very early feasibility study with LabCorp, which is a group that does clinical lab testing throughout the U.S. And we brokered a collaboration with them to say, can we identify people who have given permission to be contacted for research opportunities through their clinical labs by doing some targeted emails and offering no-cost retinopathy screening to patients. Will they come into our centers? And if they come in, do we find that there are people that are eligible for the studies that we're currently doing, and are they willing to participate? So this is an ongoing effort, but the early results are promising, and I'm really excited about trying to find new ways to bring these participation opportunities to people.
Thank you for that. I'm going to refer back to one other thing that Dr. Peters said earlier, and I think it's the key to making this happen, and it's the word trust. Trust by the patient, would-be trial participant, in the system, in the people that they're interacting with. Not to have them do something they don't want to do or shouldn't do, but something that they can be informed about in a way that will encourage them to participate. All right, let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about type 1 diabetes more specifically and some of the unique challenges of developing beta cell replacement for individuals who live with lifelong insulin therapy to compensate for what their own beta cells, their own islets, are no longer doing. Anastasia, JDRF plays an incredibly important role in supporting early research on beta cell replacement as a potential cure for type 1 diabetes. And there's been some really exciting progress in this field over the last 2 years. There's a lot more that needs to be done. Are there some unique challenges that trials on beta cell replacement pose for investigators and for subjects that they are recruiting that is not necessarily seen with other complications or control issues with type 1 diabetes?
No, thank you for that question. Beta cell replacement therapies are new and they are novel in research, and we're really at the very beginning stages of understanding what the challenges are going to be. I've been really heartened by the other folks on the panel, these extraordinary clinicians and investigators, and thinking about how do we include everybody in these trials and make sure that that they have all the information they need to make a decision and the right support all the way through the trial. So I just wanted to highlight a new group that JDRF has formed, in all humility, called the Participant Advisory Council. And the goal of this group is to create a collection. We now have 35 members and growing, of diverse voices of people who are underinsured, uninsured, or very well insured, probably represented across Dr. Peters' patient panel. We want people of all races and ethnicities, of ages, and in different stages of type 1 diabetes, meaning maybe they are in early stage type 1 diabetes where they have autoantibodies but don't yet require insulin, all the way through to having different complications. And our goal here for investigators listening is to include the voices of these individuals in the very earliest stages of clinical trial design, so that that study can be informed by the community and by, again, a diverse community. And for people listening out there living with type 1 diabetes, we'd love for you to contact us if you are interested in and have participated in clinical trials and are living with type 1 diabetes, to help us. We get a lot of requests at JDRF from investigators, from companies, from academic investigators. We're here to really be the matchmaker. What I can say about your question specifically from the perspective of potential participants is these therapies can be complex. They can involve administering more than just the investigational product, and might also require other doctors like surgeons to implant the cells. So I think understanding the purpose of the study, really having enough information, and the study phase, whether it's a phase 1 or phase 2, which is more focused on safety, or a phase 3 down the road, which is looking at a more established therapy, is going to be important for people to understand. So it may sound very academic, this discussion of phases of studies, but it's really not, because it should inform somebody's decision to participate. I think participants need to think about the time and cost and the commitment to follow-up procedures and extra visits or labs. But again, there are positives to this because of that intensity of care that we've discussed. And I think, remember, people living with type 1 diabetes, that management is almost entirely in their hands, 365 days a year, and they have to make day-to-day decisions. Sometimes study protocols require that they do things differently as part of the study. So this will be part of the decision-making. And then There's a lot in the news about cell therapies. And so people immediately want to enroll themselves and their child, but really they need to understand what these studies are trying to achieve, why they may or may not be eligible due to the inclusion criteria and the scope of the study procedures involved. So we think that those are important things that people in the community are thinking about. For investigators, similarly, these are complicated study designs, and they're going to involve other partners across care, surgeons, interventional radiologists, anesthesiologists. So the investigators and their staff and study coordinators really have to manage all of this and educating people enrolling. So it is a big change, and we think we're ready for it, but in all humility, again, we're still learning because we're at those early phases.
And indeed, we're in the early phases. So people out there, don't think about phase 3 for islet cell replacement yet. We're a long way from that. Right. And in fact, it's the earlier trials that are sometimes a bit more challenging because the perceived risk-benefit ratio for early clinical trials are somewhat different for potential subjects, clinicians involved in them, and the regulators, all of whom or each of whom has different views on the risk versus the potential benefits. So education is key. Trust is key. Informed consent is absolutely essential. And my question now, and this is both to you, Anastasia, and to Anne, is do we need to develop any special approaches to the informed consent process to more fully educate and engage potential subjects without scaring them unduly or putting them at increased risk, because that's the balance, because of lack of understanding of what's involved in the procedure. I'm not talking about beta cell replacement and its follow-up. Anne, why don't you go first on that if you feel comfortable?
Yes, and this makes me think. So one of the problems, first of all, is true informed consent. And I know a lot about these studies because I'm on the scientific advisory board for Vertex. And so I know the complexity of these studies, and I know that people have to take a lot of time off of work. And I think oddly, what you'd have to say to my patients is, can you miss a day of work every other week? Or can you miss 2 weeks to recover from the surgery? And my patients can't. And it's not that I don't want them to do research, be involved in research, but if they miss even a day of work, they can be fired. If they miss a day of work, they may not be able to afford food that week. And I feel like it's almost things that are this complicated. And again, I don't want to leave anybody out, but you have to make sure that when you're discussing the trial, you explain exactly what it means and what it could mean if there was a problem. And I think they're going to be, I can't wait till we're in phase 3 and I don't have to give immunosuppression. And I can do this and make people who really need to be made better. But the early stuff, I think for many would be such a burden that it would be really hard, even though theoretically I think they'd want to participate.
Anastasia, anything to answer there?
Yeah, I just want to underline what Dr. Peters said about informed consent. It's at the ethical core of research conduct. And, people who are conducting research are adhering to those good clinical practice guidelines and to the principles that undergird ethical research. So beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. So that's essential that that's happening where the clinical trial is being conducted. Our role at JDRF, we feel, is to make sure our constituents have knowledge to the extent we can reach everybody, and we're trying to understand their rights and protections as part of the informed consent process and really utilizing this in their decision making. And the key there is really the ability to ask questions. And I think Dr. Amador said it in a language where they feel comfortable answering questions, and not just during the consent, but all the way through the trial. So we need to think about the availability of clinicians who can speak multiple languages for inclusion for some people. I would also just say that every investigational therapy is going to have its own unique set of risks and benefits. The type of cell being used in this case, the strategy used to protect that transplanted cell, where you put it, that's all going to factor into potential risk and benefits. And again, early phase trials are just that, they're early. And so we're thinking about safety. And so I think that part of the education and counseling needs to be paramount. I would just add that I think we also want to think about the unmet needs in the type 1 diabetes community. And we heard about some of these. Type 1 is a chronic lifelong condition where the majority of people living with type 1 are not at goal. We still have significant risk of long-term cardiac, renal, and eye complications. And unfortunately, people diagnosed under the age of 10 still have a decreased life expectancy. We haven't fixed those things yet. So some of these things may figure into the equation.
Thanks, Anastasia. We're running out of time. I want to leave some time for you, the audience, to ask questions to our panelists. So take this moment, because we have one last question for everyone, to write out your questions and put it into the chat column, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. But before we leave our panelists, and I hope Dr. Peters is still available to hear this, I'd like to ask each of you and expect a 30-second answer. What approach would you take to assure broader acceptance of the need to conduct clinical trials and to participate in them with a view on achieving the equity that has been at the baseline of all we've discussed today? Let's start with the order of our introduction. So Anastasia first.
So I hope I'm not sounding repetitive, but I think it is essential that we offer the opportunity for everyone affected by a condition to participate in the study, and we provide the supports that many of the other panelists have discussed to make sure that prior to, during, and following the study, we are meeting that person's needs and supporting them. And we are aiming to do that through education, awareness, and partnerships, and by raising up the voice of people living with type 1 diabetes so they can inform clinical trial design, again, from diverse backgrounds.
Dr. Abador?
Definitely, like improving also education, not only from for the patients, but also for the physicians, for ourselves, kind of bringing tools, because we also need to kind of understand and find ways of breaking the barriers. There's always challenge on every single site that are very different, and kind of understanding how to really kind of address these different issues might be a good way of really bringing more of these groups into clinical trials and more awareness of these situations that are very specific, and they're probably very different for every single site.
Terrific. Dr. Peters, I see you're now out of vehicle and in a stable setting, which is great to see.
Yes.
Did you hear the question, Ann, or should I repeat it for you?
No, I heard the question and it made me think, because it made me think actually what is equity? And it made me wonder, because my patients, the first thing they want is education, which they don't have. And when I do a clinical trial, as I heard you all talk about, I give them a certain kind of equity that they never had before. They get a study coordinator teaching them about diabetes and bringing them up to a level where they can actually participate. And so I think this is really complicated, but I think that the notion that we should help as many people as we possibly can is obviously vital, but that each community does differ, and that just because one person from one community is under-resourced is on a panel doesn't mean that they speak for all of our communities. And I think if it were me, I'd make every trial have a sliding design, which means what are the pieces of this would work in your community? You know, my community needs, I don't know, research study windows that are longer because my patients can't promise you they'll come in every week, or my community needs more time up front for informed consent, or for drivers to get my patient. I don't know what it is, but it's almost like if you're going to do a study, a national study, you should have people from each site really talk about their community needs, and actually then have community members from each site. And to me, that's a kind of equity, because otherwise it's going to be, we think this for you here, but that's not what's right for there. So I think we're all talking about the same thing, which is inclusion and an equity that recognizes the disparities at the same time and trying to help in all ways.
Thank you very much. Jennifer?
Wow. Well, I have to say, you know, everything that has been said before words of wisdom that I completely agree with in terms of breaking down barriers, being sensitive, the idea that different communities have different needs are all important. I guess what I will add to that discussion is the idea that I think it's really important to build the culture of understanding, both in the medical professional world, for those of us that do clinical research and that care for patients, that clinical research is of huge value because it lets us impact care and improve patient outcomes in ways that reach far beyond our individual clinic, our individual patient sitting in front of us. And I think simultaneously, the flip side of that is to build the culture for patients to understand that their participation in clinical research and clinical trials has enormous value and has, again, repercussions, out down decades and years into the future for their families and for the people that they love that will come after them.
Beautifully stated. Thank you, Jennifer. We do have a couple of questions from our listening audience. And the first one comes from Kathy Boyd, who says, I'd like to know why there are age restrictions on most trials. She says she's 71 and she's had type 1 diabetes in 2022. She's been in several Medtronic trials and truly enjoyed them and feel that she can contribute. And I understand declining health, but she's in fairly good shape. And so why do companies, I'll I guess go to Dr. Amador for this, age limit enrollment in clinical trials?
I completely understand the question, and it's sometimes very challenging for us to kind of put or set up kind of these types of limitations, but we also need to kind of look into the average population. We need to kind of take into account that the older the person gets, there's the more confounders kind of this brings also to the trial, and the more challenges for us later on to understand or interpret the data. Like to give you an example, with, for example, diabetic eye disease, the higher the HbA1c goes, like if we don't cap it to 12%, the more other comorbidities could potentially be confounding the fact that this patient is losing vision. The same with age. The more the person ages, the more risk of other comorbidity, like, for example, cardiac issues with the heart, or issues with other problems that tend to kind of affect older folks. And even a very common disease of the eye, for example, which is macular degeneration. That's another situation that is very, very similar to how it affects the retina compared to diabetic retinopathy. So you start getting these additional confounders that eventually, when we analyze the data, unfortunately, will not be very favorable and would not be helping that much.
So I think you're absolutely correct that confounding factors can, particularly in smaller trials, can really affect the outcomes and may prevent an efficacious medicine from being approved because of background noise. The good news, bad news is that we're seeing more and more people with type 1 diabetes who are in the older age ranges, and there is a good reason to study them specifically in terms of either technologies or medications to determine their outcomes. So I think this is really, really important stuff in terms of age, and thank you for bringing that up. Indeed, if you're still on the line, Ms. Voigt, Anastasia would love you to contact her and be part of one of their panels. So you may suddenly be a participant here. The hour is 6:13. We have 2 minutes to close. But we have, hold on here. Okay. I'm going to just read something here from somebody with a long history in type 1 diabetes from Dayton Coles. The recommendation for their clinician is probably the best way to motivate people with diabetes to join a clinical trial. But as already stated, most clinicians don't have time in clinic visits to discuss available trials. How can we reach HCP offices to discuss and recommend trial participation to their patients? Anastasia, JDRF is very active in this. Can you just, in 30 seconds.
Yes, so I completely agree with Dayton. I think it was mentioned earlier that we need to engage healthcare professionals at all different settings to talk with people they see about clinical research and why it's important. What we understand from some publications is only clinical research is only mentioned in about 0.2, not 2, but 0.2% of clinic visits. It rarely gets mentioned during clinic visits and why it's important and where somebody should go to learn more. We've got some clinical trial education videos. We would love to have them running in your clinic. They're unbranded, but they talk about stuff we've talked about today, the phases of clinical trials, what it's like to participate, what are some of the benefits. And they're targeted to, again, individuals sitting in that clinic waiting room so they can then go ask their healthcare professional. But I agree, we need to do more work in this space as well to make sure people are talking about research and its importance.
I think educating physician and physician offices is a key to identifying individuals who are appropriate for clinical trials. Thank you. I want to thank all our panelists for sharing their considerable expertise, for Dr. Peters on the go and managing to get into this meeting. Thank you so much, Ann.
Sure.
You provided insights into the process of conducting clinical trials that are new to many of the listeners. Diabetes research, whether on improving outcomes for eye disease or developing a new field of beta cell replacement, could not proceed without the contributions of these dedicated healthcare professionals, that is, the speakers that we just heard from. And it cannot proceed without you, the audience, participating and talking about clinical trials. So I want you to think about how you can help move scientific advances into clinical reality. And one way of doing that is by participating in or supporting diabetes clinical trials. Thank you so much for participating in this session. Thank you for Diatribe for putting on the session, Diatribe sponsors for allowing this to happen, and certainly again to our 4 speakers for their expertise and their affability and their ability to communicate so clearly the issues that were presented to them. So I wish you all a good evening, a wonderful holiday season for safety and peace around the earth. Thank you very much.